Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. The future of Egypt's peace deal with Israel now hinges entirely on the issue of Palestinian refugees. Egyptian officials are reportedly telling their Israeli counterparts, quote, if even one Palestinian refugee crosses over, the peace agreement will be nullified, end quote. That comes in response to IDF military plans to go from the southern Gazan city of Khan Yunis to Rafah, which is where Hamas still has a stronghold. It's also where Egypt controls its only border crossing with Gaza. The tense situation has our next guest asking if Biden's disastrous foreign policy will lead to Jimmy Carter's Camp David Accords becoming the latest casualty of his tumultuous time in office. Joining us now to discuss is national security researcher John Rossomando. John, thanks for being here tonight. Can you talk to us about your concerns with Carter's Camp David Accords?
Well, let's put it this way. Jimmy Carter was arguably the worst president of the 20th century when it came to American prestige. Now we have Joe Biden, who is even worse. I mean, the one highlight of Carter's presidency was brokering the peace agreement between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. But now, thanks to Joe Biden's effort to appease Iran, and that gave billions of dollars to the terror proxies around the region, and to Hamas, which used it to carry out the terror attacks, now we see the Camp David Accord about to potentially become unraveled thanks to Joe Biden's incompetence.
And if it were to unravel, how might that affect, I was going to say stability in the Middle East, but I mean, that sounds like an oxymoron at this point, especially under Biden and since the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th. But how might that affect the power balance that we're seeing in the Middle East right now, especially with Iran and its proxies on the march?
Well, it's hard to say. The one thing I can say is that Egypt really despises the Iranians, despises the Islamists. One of the reasons that the Egyptians are so against having the Palestinian refugees in Sinai is because it views them as terrorists. The Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, and during the Sisi era, not the Sisi, they've gone after the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas has armed Muslim Brotherhood terrorists in Egypt. So you can see their concern.
And that was actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I did want to ask you about the fact that Egypt is so upset when it comes to the Palestinian refugee crisis that they're saying if they even catch wind of one trying to cross over their border and sneak into their nation, that could put an entire peace deal and decades of a peace agreement at risk. And of course, here in the U.S. and parts of Europe, we've got some Congress people like Rashida Tlaib trying to campaign to bring in who knows how many thousands of them into our nation. And yet in Egypt, they're saying not even one. So does that go back to what you're saying is the fear of a terror threat and also some of the conflicts that they have with Hamas?
Well, the Egyptians are like, if we end up having to take care of all these Gazans, it becomes our problem. It'll destabilize Egypt. I mean, Sisi is just coming out of nearly close to a decade of a Muslim Brotherhood terror campaign under the guise of ISIS in the Sinai that was armed and trained by Hamas from Gaza. So there's a lot of animosity there. And also the Egyptians dislike Netanyahu because they see him as a divisive figure who has prevented any sort of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And so it dislikes Hamas on one extreme and dislikes Netanyahu on the other.
So there's just so many moving pieces when it comes to this, because I wanted to ask you that if Egypt is concerned about a terror threat into its own borders with Palestinian refugees, and so they're already, putting the squash on that one, but at the same time, Israel has been under attack. There were word, especially at the beginning of the invasion, there was fear of a second front being opened with Hezbollah. So there's a lot going on. So I wanted to ask you if Egypt had aided Israel at all in its fight against Hamas, since they both have a shared enemy in Hamas, or as you were saying, is some of their concerns with Netanyahu getting in the way of what could be an effective alliance in this case?
Well, let's put it this way. There's a lot of, anti-Israeli animus in a high levels in anti-Semitism in the Egyptian government. So, you know, I think that maybe somebody like Yitzhak Rabin, if somebody like that had been running Israel, you might have had more conciliatory approach from Cairo. However, the Egyptian foreign ministry looks at Netanyahu as an extremist who's every bit as bad in their opinion as Hamas.
So with the IDF having its sights set on Rafah and the border crossing there, I know they've also mentioned weeks ago that for them controlling all the border of Gaza, even where Egypt has control, that they would like to have operational control because there's fear that any kind of weakness in that border, you could see weapons and jihadis and others being smuggled in through that. And so obviously we see what some of their aims are there, but can you talk to us about the IDF and some of their plans right now when it comes to defeating Hamas and specifically when it comes to Rafah itself?
Well, they're finishing up the mopping up of Khan Yunis, which is the second largest city in the Gaza Strip, which has been a heavy Hamas presence. They just recovered documents from Yahya Sinwar, the all intents and purpose Hamas governor of Gaza, showing that he had received over $100 million from Iran. And they're moving toward Rafah. But the one thing, and that makes the Egyptians uncomfortable, meaning are they going to force the Palestinians into the Sinai, which is some of the radicals on the right in Israel have suggested. And let's not forget that those terror tunnels that were used to smuggle arms into Gaza were used to smuggle arms into the Sinai during the Muslim Brotherhood inspired uprising against Sisi's rule in the past decade. So the Egyptians are very sensitive.
Oh, definitely. John, like I said, there's a lot of moving pieces. It's hard to keep track of it all, but somehow you do. So that's why I appreciate having you on. Thanks for joining us tonight.